Achtung Panzer! You are listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, and we are delighted to be joined by Nick Moran. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you. I have to say, I got a heads up that you were talking to me, and in your last podcast, I'm listening to it going, oh my God, he's bigging me up like nobody's business. I'm not that good. There are actually people who know more about tanks than I do.
Well, rubbish. I don't know about that. Now, Nick, you're in Texas. In the heart of Texas.
San Antonio, okay. Alamo City, also known as Military City, USA.
Fantastic. So you're surrounded by tanks, AFVs at all times, yeah?
I wish. I was actually very disappointed. My other career, I'm a reservist in the National Guard, and Texas used to have an armored division. There isn't outside of one training school, there isn't a tank in the Texas Guard anymore. Very disappointing. But there are a couple of museums. That must be
incredibly disappointing. Now, I came across you on the internet, and then said to James, "You've got to check this guy out." I think it's fair to say that you're part of let's put it this way: a new wave of looking at particularly Western Allied armour. Another way of looking at this subject that had become pretty much encrusted in its own sort of historiography, its own sort of tropes and memes and all that sort of thing. And you're very much interested in saying, hang on a minute, we need to look again at some of this stuff, aren't you?
Correct. I'm not the only one doing this, of course.
No, of course not.
And I think there are two people that you particularly bring credit to. Steve Zaloga is one of them, American author. And he started off, I think, I'm not going to call it Sherman Revisionism, because that implies that there was something to revise that was wrong in the first place, because there was nothing wrong with the Sherman. You guys know that. I've heard you talk very lovely about the Sherman. And he wrote two books in particular. Armored Thunderbolt was a good overview of how the Sherman was developed and designed. And more recently, and I think this is the bit that somebody like David Willey would accept as well, he wrote a book called Armored Champion. And it's wonderful. So both Willey and myself have used a term which Americans don't understand because it doesn't exist here, is that people look at tanks like they're top trumps.
Yeah.
I play 8.8 centimeter gun, you play 10 centimeters of armor, I win, whatever. It doesn't exist here. And of course, that's not how, you know, I've heard you talk about it, that's not how tanks work. And in Armored Champion, he looks at this traditional, this tank is better than that tank, under two categories. One he calls soldier's choice, i.e. if you were Joe Smith and you wanted to be in a tank, which one would you be in? And even at that, that's questionable, because there is the perception of what is safer and there's the actual reality of what is safer. But let's leave that aside for now. So if you're in World War II and your perception is the Panther has a bigger gun, better armor, you probably want to be in it. And of course, this is without the benefit of the statistical assessments afterwards. The other thing that he does is he also rates tanks under commander's choice or general's choice. If you want to win a war, which tank do you want? And he does this for every year from 1939 to 1945, and very rarely are the two tanks the same. I think one year, I can't remember which tank it was, I think it might have been the Sturmgeschütz. Right. He picked commander's choice and troop choice as the same. Every other year it's different.
But Nick, when he's talking about commanders, is he talking about kind of regimental commander, battalion commander level, or is he talking general?
Probably more general, so division or corps or army level, much higher.
So the kind of battle you're trying to fight, not on a quasi-strategic level, rather than simply the tactical thing in front of you.
So we're talking about bear line or someone like that.
Yeah, something like that. So I mean, the idea is you're looking at a battalion on the map, and you see this flag. It says this is the X battalion. You have in your mindset a certain, I guess if you're a war gamer, a combat power. Just how much can this battalion do? And with an American unit and later in the war British units, you got a pretty fair idea what that is. It may not be as high as the theoretical level of a German battalion, let's say. But at least you know what it is and you can make a reasonable estimation of what you need. And if you're an infantry commander, you have a reasonable estimation that, yes, a tank will come along and support you. Whereas a German, if you look at a battalion flag for the Germans, yes, you know that there's a colonel, you know that there's an aide-de-camp and so on, but you're not entirely sure, do they have 10 panzers or do they have 40 panzers? Without actually going and looking at the statistics and then hoping that it doesn't change in between when you got your last report and when you actually send them into battle.
Right.
Yeah.
And again,
which is very much the reality of how the German army's working from 1942 onwards, isn't it? It's
I think it's even earlier. I remember James talking to me about the Luftwaffe after 1940. How you have your paper strength of a squadron and the actual strength of a squadron.
Yeah, and you're absolutely
the British
right.
had their reserves.
You know, in something like a situation in Normandy, orders come up from sort of corps level to, let's just say, the Hitler Jugend division, the 12th Waffen SS, to Panzermeer, and it says, right, go and counterattack against this gap that's developed here. And so he goes, okay, fine, Jawohl, I'm on it. What have we got? And he finds he's only got 4 Panzer IVs left. And so the kind of, the company commander that's got those 4 Panzer IVs goes, but I've only got 4 Panzer IVs. And Panzermeer just goes, well, that's just too bad. You just got to go and fill that hole. And he goes, Jawohl, and off he goes. But as you say, Panzermeer might have thought there were 10. I mean, it's at any given moment, it's really, really hard to know if you're a divisional commander how many armoured fighting vehicles you've got, because it's such a fluid situation, and because you haven't got that sort of resupply that the Americans and Canadians and British do. Yeah,
there was a test that the British Army did. It was called Exercise Dracula. And I've written about it, and I think people take the wrong impression from this. They look at it because the Sherman did so well. It was basically they ran each tank 2,500 miles. All the way up, if the distance was all the way up from John O'Groats down to, and back and twice, whatever. The British tanks didn't do well. Okay, they fixed them, generally speaking, by the time they got to war. But the American tanks at the time were fantastic. And if you look at what the officers were saying, there was one line particularly: a battalion commander can be confident that he will have at least 99% of his tanks available after driving 1,000 miles. And that tells you, I mean, he may have been exaggerating a little thing, but that's the mindset that you have to have.
That's the legacy of North Africa, though, isn't it? Of 41, 42 in North Africa, where the British-made tanks are simply fall into pits of reliability problem pits, don't they? Where they keep being so reliability edges its way to the front of what your battle commander wants, isn't it? Rather than firepower, rather than armour, he's just saying, as long as I know how many tanks I've got on the start line, that's the thing that matters to me more than anything else.
And if I realise that they have a worse gun, then I can just take that into account at the beginning. And the Soviets, particularly, especially in the Cold War, it's all mathematical tables. And when it's almost like the Soviet officer, their job wasn't to make tactical decisions as much as to assess the situation that they are in, and then go to the book of instruction and say, okay, in this situation, which I think we are in, the book tells me I need to have this many battalions of this many regiments of artillery, this, and so on and so forth.
To bring this firepower to bear to this situation.
Correct, because that is what is calculated to give me the victory.
So he gets essentially gets his slide rule out and plots. Gosh, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, really, but it makes perfect sense. It really does, especially for the Soviet situation where they didn't necessarily train so well.
Yeah, but also, so you're not just going, oh my God, they've got lots of Panthers and we haven't got big enough tanks. You're thinking, okay, I need this number of tanks, but I also need this number of anti-tank guns and this number of mortars and artillery supporting me as well before I kind of go into this battle.
And a whole lot. And again, as you've mentioned in the past, tank versus tank isn't all that critical in the big scheme of things anyway.
It's about 7%, isn't it, I think? It's worked out.
Something like that. And then 20% anti-tank guns.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you look at the assessment, I mean, everybody tries, even the army tries to make these assessments. And there was one after the war that says, okay, we think on average a Panther was worth 1.2 Shermans, or whatever the figure was. Which is fine, because you can do that mathematically, because you do the assessments, there was a tank there, there was a tank there. Now, the problem is, and again, this is also, what tank would you want to be in? If you're an infantryman, and that was what most people were, and you are faced with an MG-34 and MG-42 against you, you really don't care how good the tank is as long as it is better than an MG-42. And if you're an allied person, the chances are you can get on the horn and you can say, guys, I need a tank, please. And then lo and behold, 4 or 5 Shermans roll up and they save you. But there's no way to statistically account for how many infantry lives were saved by the fact that a Sherman, which, yes, would lose in a one-on-one duel against a German tank, more often than not, and even that comes with an asterisk, you can't account for that. And to the infantryman, the tank that shows up to shoot the machine gun is the most glorious, best tank in the world.
Right. So your infantryman has a completely different view of this stuff.
He does. He wants tank support.
Which is why in reverse a Stug 3 is perfectly good. If we're looking at it from the German perspective, that actually, when we've talked about this before, so why not make more of those, and why waste time on the bigger vehicles? Because if it's about integrated arms, if it's about, like you say, the infantryman being rescued by the tank, a Stug 3, a Stug 4 is perfectly serviceable, does that job, doesn't matter, doesn't need to have an 88mm gun on it, and so on.
Correct. Now, there is one more caveat in this, because if you're the German, there's always this argument you see online, the Germans shouldn't have made so many Panthers and should have sent more with the more reliable Stugs or Panzer IVs. Well, here's the problem. A Panther still takes a 5-man crew like a Panzer IV. If you only have 5 men available and the German army is starting to run a little bit short on personnel and fuel and so on, do you want them in a Panzer IV or do you want them in a Panther? Or better yet, a Panzer IV or a Sturmgeschütz?
Yeah.
And there's no two ways that the Panzer IV is better overall than a Sturmgeschütz.
Right. Yeah, but it is still a numbers game, isn't it? I mean, one of the arguments is that if you can't produce gargantuan numbers of tanks, then you might as well have fewer of really good tanks. So then there is a kind of sort of weird logic to having the Tiger and the Panther, which are incredibly complex. But you've still got to be able to support them in the field. So if you haven't got enough cranes and hoists and, tank transporters and fuel and the men to kind of do it. I mean, because, there's that kind of famous document, German tank maintenance done by the Americans, kind of, I think it's, yeah, right. And basically what it says is, sort of lack of German tank maintenance is a better title. But actually they have the structures for it. And actually the structures for tank maintenance in the field are basically the same as the Americans, basically the same as the British. The problem is they don't have enough trained men and they don't have enough trained people to man drivers and all the rest of it because they don't have many vehicles in the first place. So your 19-year-old recruit is being rushed through training, hasn't driven a car before anyway because they don't have many cars and there isn't much fuel. And then he's confronted with a Tiger or a Panther, which is an incredibly difficult thing to drive because it's so complex. Unlike a Sherman, which is kind of, 4 forward and 1 back and it's kind of manual and, everyone drives in America and they're kind of used to it. So it's a kind of, your start point is it's a bit like kind of putting a 19-year-old who's just passed his driving test into a kind of Ferrari. It doesn't, the chances are they're going to cock it up. Whereas if you just put them into a kind of, a Chevrolet, it'll be fine. And that's the kind of the difference. And the problem you've got from all the way through their time is that they just don't have enough field maintenance to be able to sustain those kind of complex.
But they don't have enough people. They don't have enough people. Full stop.
They don't have enough people. Full stop.
I mean, because after all, before Barbarossa, there's that vacation people are given. Soldiers are given to go back to their jobs to work in munitions factories and stuff. Two's writes about this. There's you get a sort of 4-month furlough to go and make ammunition before you return to your unit to fight because they're so short of people and they're short of skilled labour. They're short of soldiers and of skilled labour. There's just not enough. There's just not enough pieces on the chessboard for them to play a proper game.
The only winning move is not to play, as the movie said.
Exactly right. Yeah.
But I do remember that, after Operation Goodwood, I think it was the 2nd Battalion of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry had lost 37 of their, 50-odd tanks. And, so by the 20th of August, they were out of the picture. And yet by the 30th of July, by the 30th of July, not only had they completely rebuilt their regiment, their battalion. I mean, they were absolutely back at full strength. They'd moved and were ready for the start of Operation Bluecoat. I mean, that's pretty impressive support, isn't it? That you can have an armoured unit that is basically completely wrecked in 2 days of fighting in Operation Goodwood, and 10 days later it's back to full strength.
And of course, you have to have the crewmen. It's not just getting replacement tanks off the factories and off the ships. You've also got to have the crewmen who survived the previous experience.
Yep.
And have to be persuaded to get back into those tanks. I mean, this is always again the one of the things I think we've talked about a lot across the podcast is that, you know, the Allies don't have the means at their disposal to get people back into those vehicles, do they? They don't have their fanatic Nazi imbibed, you know, people who've grown up under Nazism, so are fully programmed, especially the younger people that the Germans have, you know, they don't have the option of shooting people if they don't do as they're told either, not really. So how you get crews back into tanks after a thing as famous, as notorious as Goodwood is an interesting question, isn't it?
I think that goes back much further. So it just happened by sheer and complete coincidence. I was at Gettysburg last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, and I'm looking at the ground that was Pickett's charge. 3/4 of a mile of open ground.
Yep.
And you got guys standing shoulder to shoulder, advancing into fire, knowing that they're presenting a wonderful target. And I'm there. How do you get people to do that? I mean, I don't know. I really don't. And happily, I've never been tested with that question myself, because I have a 70-something ton Abrams and I'm invulnerable. At least I like to think I am. But no, it's, and you see how many times somebody had a tank shot out from under them to get back in. I think even Lafayette Poole, the American tank ace, I think he had 2 tanks shot out from under him before the third one finally put him out for good. He lost his leg.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was just looking at the Battle of Geilenkirchen, November 1944, where the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry are supporting the 84th Infantry Division, US 84th Infantry Division. And John Semkin, who is the commander of A Squadron in the Sherwood Rangers, he has the unique distinction of his tank hitting 4 mines simultaneously. But they all survive. So it's obviously the tank becomes immediately shoeless, and they get out, and he jumps into another tank, which, you know, half an hour later gets knocked out. He jumps out of that one again, goes into a third tank, and eventually that one gets knocked out. So he gets knocked out of 3 tanks in one day.
Dear God.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you just gotta tip your hat to the guys. They said, "Look, we're here to do a job. Let's do the damn job so we can go home."
Yeah. Yes, which is probably the explanation, actually. But again, one I can't begin to relate to or understand. We've got to take a break right now. We're talking to Nick Moran. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James Holland and I are talking to Nick Moran. Tanks. So, Nick, why did tanks draw your, obviously, your deep fascination and interest? What was it? I mean, is it simply tanks are cool? Because they are.
The start of it, really. I remember when I was, before I joined the American Army, I did a little stint in the Irish Reserves. And I remember the sergeant, just asking, "Why did you join?" And people, the normal answer is patriotism, duty, sense of service. And okay, I'll tell you why I joined, says the sergeant. It's because I just watched Rambo the day before, and I thought, oh, that could be me, going around with a machine gun. And I was interested in the Navy before I got into the Army. And I was playing war games, Harpoon, whatever. And I was thinking to myself, well, what would new recruit, seaman recruit Moran be doing in the Irish Navy? And I have visions of myself standing watch at 2 a.m. January in the North Atlantic, being battered, cold, wet, and miserable. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I'm going to be cold, wet, and miserable, at least let me not worry about having to swim to shore. So I joined the army, and I didn't think this through, though, because in the Navy, after you're done with your 2 hours of being cold, wet, and miserable, you go inside, and there's electricity and heating and whatever. And in the army, you get into your cold, wet sleeping bag, and you continue to be miserable until it's time to wake up, which you can't do because you never fell asleep in the first place because you're too cold, wet, and miserable. So anyway, I was in a cav unit in Ireland, and not much armor, whatever. It's still fun. So I come to the US, and I decide, for some silly reason, I miss the army life. And I have this sort of misguided sense of socio-moral responsibility that if the country's good enough for me to want to actually come to it, I'll give a little back. And my initial thought was that there was an Air Force unit near me. It was an air rescue wing, and they do both combat search and rescue, and in peacetime they do civilian search and rescue in the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas of California or off the California coast. And I figure that's a fairly honourable way of serving and wearing a uniform. The recruiter never called me back for whatever reason. So I had a friend of mine who says, "Hey Nick, we're shooting some tanks down in Fort Hunter Liggett. Do you want to come and watch?" Yeah, all right, I'll come watch. So I'll go down, I'll watch, and I realised I could do that. That looks fun. So I join. I go to the recruiter, say, "I'd like to be a tanker, please." They look at me and say, "Well, you're too tall and too colorblind." Ah, okay, what can I do? What do you do as a civilian? "Oh, I work IT." "Great, we'll put you into IT." I said, "No, I work IT Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 anyway. On the weekend, I want to blow things up." And they're looking at me like I have two heads. So I said, why is this a hard concept to understand? Eventually, look, how do I get into tanks? It turns out to be the correct thing to say is, if I don't get what I want, I'm walking out the door. Which in the US Army, where you have to get recruited. So in Ireland, it's like you put an ad in the paper and there are 10 applicants for every place in the army. But in the US, the recruiters have to earn their living and actually get people to sign on. And they come up with a couple of different options for me to get into armor that are legal, but kind of skirt the rules a little bit.
Right.
And I choose one of them, and I ended up in a tank, and I'm happy to say I took my tank to Iraq, which most tankers did not. There is an acronym for that, for tanker without a tank. Which has a slightly different connotation in the US than the UK.
Yeah, slightly different. Yeah.
You get the idea.
Yeah,
That's very funny.
And so I went with the tank. I was happy enough. Then I was also fortunate enough to move to Bradleys. So I did tanks, I did Bradleys, and not many armor officers get to do that, because usually you end up in a striker unit or a cav or a light cav unit or something like that, just to spread you around. So I got lucky with that, and I started volunteering at a tank museum in California, the old Littlefield collection, which is now, most of it has been split up. So, and it's in all sorts of places. If you go to Cairns, Australia, Rob Lowe has put together an amazing private collection, absolutely huge, in like 4 years. Astounding. And of course, the only reason to go to Cairns is if you're going to the Great Barrier Reef, so it's a vacation. You tell the wife to bugger off there, go shopping or something like that, while you spend a day at Cairns. So he bought a bunch of these vehicles that were in California. The core of the collection went to the Collings Foundation up in Boston, Massachusetts.
Right.
That area, technically Hudson Stowe. So if you're in that area, they have a absolutely pristine collection. And unlike most museums, when you go to Bovington, when you go to Sumur or whatever, you'll see normally the hatches are closed. Because what they've really done is the tank is a bit of a wreck. They've painted it up on the outside to make it look nice. But if you were to look inside, behind the curtain, you realize that they're kind of wrecks. The Massachusetts Museum, all the hatches are open. And they put, including the top hatches, and they got a balcony that you can look down into the vehicles, because all these tanks are absolutely showroom factory. I mean, their Panther probably didn't look as good as it does now the day it left the factory. It's amazing. So I hung around there, and eventually I got picked up by World of Tanks, and that kind of brought me into the public eye a bit more. And we went. So
your work with World of Tanks, because I know you've spent an awful lot of time at Bovington at the Tank Museum down the road from where I am, and I mean, this is something that really struck me when I first got talking to you. Is you're poring over these tanks in kind of such intimate detail, and you're talking to the guys who maintain them as well. Whereas the average historian is just sitting in his office looking at books and kind of reading stuff and reading documents. But there is definitely a huge benefit to be had from actually going and seeing this stuff, isn't there? And sitting inside it and seeing how it works and talking to people who are working on them all the time.
There is, and I will always learn something when I go to one. I mean, there's a level, if you look at the back of, I remember looking at the back of an M3 Medium, the Grant, and I'm looking at a set of bolts on the right-hand side, directly behind the gun bulge on the sponsor. I'm thinking to myself, why are they different to all the other ones? Why are they screw heads and not typical rivet heads? And this is where a little bit of experience comes in as well, because you know roughly how a tank works, and you can start to do some assessments in your head as to what they could be. And then I realized, oh, okay, it's so that you can pull the gun out. So you undo the screws at the back, you pull the 75 all the way straight out, and you stick another one in. But it's a case of I wouldn't have thought to even look for it had I not been standing in front of the vehicle at that time.
Sure.
Then you have the question of, okay, well, there's the academic knowledge from reading the book, and then there's the practical knowledge. And that's what I try to emphasize in my books. And I know, James, you've hung out a fair bit with Richard Cutland as well, my European counterpart for World of Tanks. And I'm sure he's probably told you much of the same thing, that if you know how a tank works in practice, it makes it much easier for you to look at some obscure thing that nobody ever talks about in the book, and then figure out how it works. And why is it there? Because every single thing on the tank is there for a reason.
Right.
They didn't just put it on there to look nice.
Yeah.
So
what do you think of a kind of, you know, on some of the obvious tanks, you know, like a Sherman, a Panther, a Panzer IV, a Cromwell, or whatever. You know, when you're looking at those tanks and you've looked at them and you've pored over them in such detail, what are some things that you think? What are those examples that you're talking about, where you look at it and go, wow, okay, I never thought of that, or I hadn't twigged that, and now I'm looking at it, that all makes sense. I mean, you know, I remember standing with you and saying, this is the most important thing on the Sherman, and it was the means of hooking it. Yeah, from which you could hoist it from a ship to onto dry land.
Yeah, because what's the point of having a tank that's still stuck in the continental US? It could be the best tank in the world, but if you can't get it overseas, there's no point in it. And the way you got it overseas, well, you had to lift it up with a crane. You mentioned also the 40-ton Bailey Bridge. The American Army had, I think it was Army Regulation 850-15, something very similar to that. And that was the regulation which governed the width and the dimensions and weight of vehicles. And most people have never heard of this regulation, but the Army is very, very strict on this. And there is ample examples in the archives of armored, Ordnance Branch says this tank works. Armored Force says it works. The Chief of Engineers files a non-concurrence because it does not meet with AR 850-15 and will not fit on the Army Standard Bridge.
So too wide, too heavy, whatever.
Too wide or too heavy. And the example I give is the bridge at Remagen. So the American Army show up, oh, look, there's a bridge there. And they get across a bridge that turns out to be damaged. And it takes them, I think it was like 8 to 12 hours to fix the bridge enough that a Sherman could get across. The unit that got to Remagen also had Pershings. The Pershings couldn't get across for 3 days while they waited to get a system to get the Pershings across. So in the meantime, the infantry on the far side, if the unit had only the superior Pershing, that infantry unit would have been on their own without armor support, at least not medium tank armor support, for 3 days.
So we're right back with the infantryman and the MG34 that needs dealing with right from the start of this conversation. That exact scenario, that's what you need these regulations for, so you can deliver armor where you know you can deliver armor.
Correct. And it's not just the American side. If you look at the development for the German vehicles, so if you look at the history for the development of the Panzer III, which I think is one of the most underrated tanks ever, and arguably the best tank in the world at the beginning of the war, and you look at the requirements and the specifications, the German army listed out in sequence what they thought was most important. And I think the very first one was radius of action. And then it came down to a crew, division of labor within the crew.
Right.
And so on down. And the very, very last thing was armor. And it said also, our standard bridge is 18 tons. If you're going to make a tank more than 18 tons, think very, very carefully about how this is going to get across the river for, let's say, the Ardennes campaign. And now, if you look at it, yes, the Panzer IV was more than 20 tons. Well, you get a couple of people get out of the tank. There is a quarter ton less already. Drive it across. And there's always a little bit of wiggle room in the bridge weight classification as well. Because it's not like you put 18.1 and the thing collapses.
But bridging becomes much more important if you're advancing, doesn't it? Because
it does.
Because obviously your enemy's going to blow up the bridges as they retreat. So you're then going to have to sort that out and kind of find a solution to that blown up bridge, which invariably is something like the Class 40 Bailey Bridge. So obviously there's, as you say, there's absolutely no point in having something that's bigger than that. I mean, it's very interesting because there was a guy called Tick Bonesteel, who General Tick Bonesteel, but the time was just a colonel in 1944, and he was originally on the 21st Army Group planning team, and then was transferred over to Bradley's planning team before D-Day, and he advised that what was needed for Normandy was Pershings, because the Pershings were just coming into being and they could have brought them over. And he said, this is what we need in Normandy. And later on, when he was doing his oral history stuff with Carlyle, and when he was writing up his memoirs and all the rest of it, he was still banging this particular drum. But there's very good reasons for not having Pershings in Normandy, aren't there?
Well, for starters, Armoured Force had said we do not want this vehicle.
Right.
So if you look at the timeline for Pershing, so in 1940, late 42, early 43, the US.
Oh, we should just say incidentally that the Pershing is what, 56 tons. I mean, it's a sort of equivalent to a Panther and a Tiger.
That's a little less than that. It's closer to a Panther. It's maybe 45 ton.
Right.
And so in 1942 to 1943, the US Army and it's in the archives, have a deliberate decision to make to attack Germany. Do we go with the Sherman that we know, or the Pershing that we don't know, but which ordnance are telling us is better? And if you think about it, they are now gambling the fate of Western civilization on, is ordnance telling us correctly that the Pershing is better? And they have there's a long backstory of ordnance saying this is the greatest thing on earth, and sometimes being right, and sometimes not being right.
Right.
So in 1943, the U.S. Army said, no, we're going with Sherman. Continue to work on the other vehicles in the meantime, but for now, we're going with Sherman. And they just turn up the taps so much that by the end of the war, they've actually stopped producing the things as fast as they need to. So if you look at the production values, so how many tanks were built in 43 versus 44, you see that the Americans started shutting it down. Because if they look, we've already built enough. By the time any more get built and we send them overseas, the war's going to be over either way. So why bother? And Pershing shows up, a physical specimen that ordnance now says works without the electric drive and everything else in January or February of 44, which now means you have 6 months from the first prototype to have the thing tested, approved, and built in sufficient numbers that it's actually worth bringing to Normandy. Then Armored Force get a hold of it and said, look, I realize ordnance, you guys say that the thing works, but here's a couple of problems. A, it doesn't work as well as you say it does. B, it carries only half as much ammunition as we need, and so on down the line. So I have the document. It's actually dated December 44, but it was actually written a little bit before. But it's dated December 44. T-26E1 is not battle-worthy, and we do not recommend its adoption until the following is fixed. So ordnance go back to make the T-26E3. They fix things. They put more ammunition into it at the cost of some other creature comforts. And then finally say, okay, we are going to build this. And even then they shortcutted the official situation because Army Ground Forces, their position is field troops are not a testing agency. Whereas the Germans will say, hey, we just invented this new thing. We built 2 of them. Let's send them into a combat unit and see what happens.
Rush it to the front, try it out. Yeah, see what happens to it.
Our Armored Force refused to do that. They said, look, if we are going to give our troops equipment, it will damn well do what we say it will do. It may not do as much as they want, but it will do it. Which is an interesting... So you look at the whole Firefly business, Sherman Firefly versus 76 Sherman. I am one of the few defenders of the 76 that think it's better than Firefly. Mainly because Firefly is a bodge. And you note how it didn't see service after World War II, because even the British realized it was a bodge. But I'm not going to say the British were wrong. It is a matter of perception and opinion as to what is better, to have something which has a bigger gun in the field now, which is limited because you don't shoot as fast, you can't shoot as quickly, you've got less crewmen and so on. All the liabilities that come with Firefly. Versus you have a much better tank that will show up a month or two later and in 90% of situations is better. So if you're going up against 2 Sturmgeschütz versus 1 Tiger, against 2 Sturmgeschütz you want the 76, you don't want the 17 pounder. If you're going up against a Panther, you might want the 17 pounder, or better yet, something bigger like a Yeg Panther. You might want the 17 pounder over the 76, but how often do you get in one situation versus the other? Right. And we go all the way back to the beginning of this discussion when it became a numbers game.
Yeah. It's just so interesting. So where do you? I mean, so in terms of the, I mean, you've sort of hinted at what you think about the Panther and the Tiger, but I mean, you know, what is your take on them? I mean, were the Germans right to kind of push those, or should they have, you know,
yes,
or should they have abandoned the Tiger and just built more Panthers?
Nope, remember, there are different vehicles for different roles. So Tiger, distinguish a little bit between Tiger 1 and Tiger 2. Tiger 1 was a project that started before the war. And there was a period, about 1942 or so, the army started to lose control over what they were getting, and it started to become more a matter of the whims of the politicians, or at least a certain politician's initials, Alpha Hotel. By the way, the whole Easy 8 thing, people say it's for the right. I heard you say this, Al. The World War II alphabet for the US was Abel, Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy. Yes. So anything with an E was easy. So Tiger was developed with a very specific set of requirements that the German army had. And if it met those requirements, and it's not as if the German army just came up with these requirements out of thin air. They looked at it and said, look, we need a breakthrough tank. We need something that does this, does this, does this. And Tiger developed into the way it was, half accidentally, but either way it met the requirements. And it required a lot more maintenance. But the Germans put more maintenance troops into the Tiger battalion to make up for this. So as long as Tiger was used in the role for which it was intended, it was fantastic. Right. The problem becomes when it becomes the fireman of the Eastern Front going from A to B to C, and it's no longer you in its initial role. Then it starts to get a little bit more problematic. And then when you get to King Tiger, which is an improved Tiger 1, the Germans are now almost entirely on the defensive. Do you really want a breakthrough tank?
Yeah.
And even then, you can't specifically say no, because if all you're doing is you're on the defensive, you have no initiative, and you will lose eventually.
Yes.
So you have to have a counterattack capability.
Well, and they have a counterattack mindset after all, don't they? So what else is the Mortain offensive? What else is the Bulge? It's this counterattack mindset that they've. Certainly, the politicians who are the one politician particularly who are meddling, that you have a weapon that answers that requirement, however harebrained it might be.
They say I'm not sure counterattack is all that harebrained, because if the object is to bring the Allies to a negotiating position, I mean they're not going to win, but if they can at least bring them down to a better negotiating position, they probably will have to counterattack eventually.
Yeah.
And so, and they only built 600 Tiger 2s. Whatever the number is, so
492.
Oh, there you go, even better. As for Panther, I think as we were saying before, they were correct. They had to go with the high quality, low numbers because they couldn't support high numbers of low quality.
Right.
The only thing that I mean, there were a couple of quirks that I've harped on about, like why the hell didn't they give the gunner a periscope? It's beyond me. But if they had kept the Panther to the original design specifications of maybe 6 centimeters on the front instead of 8, which Adolf insisted on, then it wouldn't have suffered the final drive reliability problems that it's so famous for example, and would have been a much more reliable vehicle. So
it's amazing, isn't it? These small things.
They are small things, but as you say, they just all add up. So I don't think the Germans were wrong in either case. It was just a matter of they were doomed from the start regardless. They shouldn't have invaded Russia.
No.
I think Montgomery had something to say on that. And number two was that they had those little niggling details of the vehicle not being designed to fit the requirements that existed at the time.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, that's just so fascinating, isn't it? It really is so interesting. All these little, I love this kind of sort of looking at it from just a slightly different perspective. I really do. I think it really opens your eyes.
Yeah.
Well, but it is also an answer to the top trumps tendency. The tank top trumping is a you can see it every day on the internet if you care to. You can get into that.
Yeah.
I mean, if we post a picture of a tank on Twitter, we'll always get someone say Tiger was the best, and you sort of think, well,
depends on what you're judging it.
Depends on what you're judging it, and for 6 months maybe, it's all these sort of. After all, the war changes relentlessly. Is the other thing, doesn't it?
It does. That you got the other question, of course, is the national industry. I mean, when did Germany really mobilize for war? And if you look at the Americans, it's a lot of people. I've mentioned him before elsewhere. A guy called Knudsen.
Yes,
probably the most important. Yeah. It's Simon K. My bad. Probably the most important person for the entire victory of World War II. And how many people don't know who he was? Obviously, you do. The U.S. Army had the Army Industrial War College, or the Army Industrial College, and its purpose was to teach officers how national industry could be mobilized to succeed in warfare. And I'm pretty sure the German army didn't have that. I'm pretty sure the British army didn't have that, honestly, but given the way that the British procurement system worked. And the Americans started 1938. They were doing things like, okay, guys, we realize that Remington, the rifle manufacturer, we realize that we have no need for 100,000 M1 Garands right now, or Garand right now. We can't afford them. We don't need them. But we are going to give you the tooling, and we're going to put in an order for a couple of thousand anyway, just so you know how to make it in case we decide we need to spin it up. And they will have the experience. They will have the tooling. They're already prepared. And this was happening as early as 1938.
Yeah,
not
that's
necessarily
amazing,
the Garand particularly, but that's the process.
Yeah.
And it's down to numbers and efficiency.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for talking to us. I have a feeling this is unfinished business.
Yes.
Come back. We can rant about this forever.
Well, literally forever. I mean, I'd like to talk to you about the Churchill from top to bottom, because that's such an interesting story, and that has a bad rep, and I don't think one it possibly deserves. I don't
know if it has a bad rep, does it?
People see it's unglamorous, isn't it? It's slow and it's boring and all that sort of thing, and early reliability problems, all that sort of stuff. But the point is, by the time its battle arrives, which is Normandy, if you see what I mean, it's the ideal vehicle for supporting that infantryman up against that MG-34.
Oh, it did fairly well in Italy as well.
Yeah, I know, but this is the point. We must do this again. Thanks so much for talking to us. Obviously, today, the listener will not know this, but the day we spoke was the day that they started counting the votes in America. We hope everything works out fine for you over there.
We'll survive. As I look over the shoulder, hang on a second. I am in Texas. I am well armed. I have my little fortifications. I have my supply of rations and solar power.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Nick, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much. Cheerio.
All right, good luck, lads.
Cheers, Nick.